Picture this. Tomorrow morning you wake up in a castle, stone walls, tapestries heavy with centuries, candles flickering in pre-dawn darkness. You're 12 years old, your hands small, your body caught between childhood and something you don't yet understand. Outside your chamber, servants prepare your wedding dress. Downstairs, your father finalizes a business transaction. Not a merger, not a contract, he's selling you. The man buying isn't someone you chose or love. He's 24, and tonight, after the ceremony, after priests bless your marriage bed, he will climb into that bed with you. Everyone will know. Everyone will watch. Everyone will wait for proof the transaction is complete. Your childhood ends today, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. This isn't fiction. This is history, real history. The kind they don't teach in textbooks because it's too disturbing, too real, too uncomfortable. But we didn't leave it behind fast enough. For hundreds of years, this was normal, expected. This was what marriage meant for countless girls across medieval Europe. This was systematic, legal, celebrated. The church blessed it. Law protected it. Society demanded it. And if you were born female in medieval Europe, this nightmare was quite possibly your destiny. You think modern relationships are complicated, dating hard. Then let me take you back. Let me show you what marriage meant when your worth was measured in land deeds. When your wedding night came with witnesses. When pregnancy was a death sentence you'd face repeatedly until your body gave out. When your husband had legal right to beat you, imprison you, kill you, and face no consequences. Welcome to medieval marriage, where happily ever after was a fantasy nobody pretended was real. The sounds of that medieval morning grow louder. Footsteps approaching. Voices discussing your dowry, your bloodline, your potential for heirs. You're 12, about to become merchandise in the most brutal transaction in human history. A transaction where the currency is a child's body and the contract is sealed in blood and tears. Ready to see what they've been hiding? What you're about to discover will make you grateful for every choice, every freedom, every relationship you walked away from. By the time we're finished, you'll understand that even your worst breakup is paradise compared to what awaited our ancestors when they heard those two terrible words. I do. Her name was Margaret Beaufort, and at 6 years old she was worth more than most kingdoms. Not because of who she was, but what she owned. Land, titles, wealth beyond imagination. In medieval England, that made her a target. Her guardians looked at this small child and saw opportunity, investment potential, so they sold her. The transaction was simple. John de la Pole received rights to Margaret and her inheritance. Margaret received a husband she'd never met, couldn't understand, had no ability to refuse. She was 6, an age when modern children learn to read, play with friends. Margaret was learning she was property, that her body belonged to whoever her guardians decided to sell her to. Margaret didn't understand what was happening. Adults put her in a wedding dress, spoke words too complex for her mind, performed ceremonies that meant nothing to her, then recorded it as legally binding. A 6-year-old girl, married and owned before she could grasp what marriage meant. 3 years later, the political landscape shifted. New opportunities emerged. Margaret's guardians saw a chance for an upgrade, so they simply dissolved her first marriage, erased it, as if those 3 years could be undone when financially inconvenient. Then they sold her again, this time to Edmund Tudor. He was 24, Margaret was 12. Unlike her first marriage, which remained unconsummated, Edmund Tudor decided he couldn't wait. The unwritten rule suggested waiting until 14, but Edmund had Margaret's inheritance and a young wife in his bed, and law was entirely on his side. Within months, Margaret was pregnant, 12 years old and pregnant. Her body was still growing, still years from being ready for medieval childbirth. Edmund Tudor saw nothing wrong. Society saw nothing wrong. Law protected his right. Margaret had no voice, no choice, no escape from what would destroy her body forever. But Margaret wasn't alone. Across the channel in France, another transaction was being finalized. Isabella of Valois, daughter of the King of France, was being married to King Richard II of England. Political implications were enormous. The alliance would reshape European power, and Isabella, centerpiece of this geopolitical chess game, was 6 years and 5 days old. Her trousseau tells you everything. Among jewels and fabrics and symbols of royal status, Isabella's trousseau included her dolls, her actual toys. Also included was miniature silver furniture for those dolls, because Isabella was still a child who played pretend. The wedding contract specified that marriage could not be consummated until Isabella's 12th birthday. Even by medieval standards, marrying a 6-year-old was recognized as extreme, but she was still married, still owned, still trapped in an arrangement she couldn't comprehend. 6 years later, she'd be expected to consummate her marriage, expected to become pregnant, expected to risk death in childbirth repeatedly. But for now, at 6, she was simply married, playing with dolls in a foreign country, legally bound to a man old enough to be her father. Before you dismiss this as ancient history, understand something crucial. These weren't mistakes. This was the system. This was normal. This was what marriage meant for the upper classes of medieval Europe. Medieval parents who arranged these marriages weren't monsters. They operated within a system that treated children, especially daughters, as economic assets. A daughter with land and titles was essentially a winning lottery ticket. And like any valuable asset, she needed to be invested wisely before something went wrong. Before war erupted, before plague struck, before opportunity was lost. So they married off children young as possible. They locked in alliances and secured wealth by sacrificing their daughter's childhood. The disturbing part is that this was completely legal, socially acceptable, religiously sanctioned. The church had rules about minimum consummation ages, but those rules disappeared when important political marriages were involved. Money talked louder than morality. Little girls paid the price. Here's the reality that makes this worse. These extreme child marriages weren't universal. Most medieval people, peasants and merchants, actually married much later. Late teens, early 20s, when bodies were developed. These horrific child marriages were primarily a rich people's problem, a consequence of having too much at stake to wait for a child's well-being. When you read about Margaret at 6, about Isabella at 6, remember this. Their suffering was optional. Their trauma was preventable. Their childhoods were stolen because adults decided money and power mattered more. They knew better. They chose not to. For Margaret Beaufort, for Isabella of Valois, for every little girl dressed in wedding clothes before she understood what weddings meant, childhood ended when someone decided their inheritance was worth more than their innocence. The wedding feast is over. Guests are drunk on wine, faces flushed with food and merriment. Musicians still play somewhere, creating a soundtrack for what comes next. And what comes next is so invasive, so humiliating, so devoid of privacy that it makes modern wedding photography look respectful. Welcome to the bedding ceremony, the medieval tradition that turned your wedding night into a public spectacle. The feast ends, and suddenly your friends, family, guests, everyone who felt like participating would escort you to your bedroom. Not to drop you off, to actively prepare you for your wedding night. Women would take the bride, bring her to the chamber and then undress her, remove every piece of clothing until she stood naked before this crowd. They'd comb her hair, offering advice, detailed instructions about what was about to happen to her body. Then they'd put her into bed and wait. Meanwhile, men would do the same with the groom. Strip him down, prepare him, give him instructions and encouragement. Then they'd escort him to the chamber where his new wife waited, and the real festivities would begin. A priest would enter, would bless the marriage bed for fertility, would speak prayers over these two people, possibly strangers, possibly children, about to engage in the most intimate act, surrounded by witnesses. Then came the stocking throwing. Bridesmaids and groomsmen would sit on either side and throw the couple's stockings at them. A direct hit supposedly meant the thrower would be next to marry. Medieval target practice with underwear, while newlyweds tried to maintain dignity. But here's where it gets truly worse. In many cases, especially among royalty, witnesses would stick around. They wouldn't watch the act itself. Even medieval people had boundaries, but they'd wait outside the bed curtains. Listen, expect evidence, proof that marriage had been consummated, proof the transaction was complete, because that's what this was about. Medieval marriage was primarily a legal and economic contract. Consummation made it official. No consummation meant no valid marriage, no inheritance rights, no political alliances, no certainty that dowry negotiations would stick. Witnesses were there to ensure the deal went through, to verify the product had been delivered. The pressure was enormous. Imagine being a young person in bed with someone you might have met days before, knowing that outside those curtains stood representatives of both families, waiting for proof you'd fulfilled your obligation, that you'd successfully consummated a marriage that would define your life. Take the wedding of Margaret of York to Charles the Bold in 1469. This was such a significant union that the bedding ceremony became elaborate. Multiple noble guests attended. Chroniclers recorded every detail. The pressure wasn't just personal, it was political. Their consummation would be analyzed, discussed, documented because it represented official sealing of a massive alliance. Before you assume this was just rich people's weirdness, understand that bedding ceremonies happened across social classes. Details varied, but the invasion of privacy, the public verification, this was widespread. In some places, particularly Scandinavia, public bedding was required by law to validate marriage. Even royalty eventually tired of this. King Charles I of England, centuries later, famously barred his bedroom door and refused. But the custom lingered. It persisted. It continued to humiliate newlyweds for another century because legal need for verification outweighed concern for privacy. For child brides like Isabella of Valois, the bedding ceremony served as constant reminder that childhood was over. Isabella went through this ritual at 6. They put her in bed with her adult husband, performed the ceremony, threw stockings, offered blessings. Yes, consummation was delayed, but the ritual happened. The message was sent. You are married. You are owned. And when you turn 12, all of this will be real. The bedding ceremony wasn't about tradition. It was about control, ownership, public verification of what should have been the most private moment. It was about reducing human beings to contractual obligations, their bodies to merchandise that needed inspection. Margaret Beaufort was 13 when she went into labor. Her husband Edmund Tudor had died of plague while she was 7 months pregnant, which meant Margaret had to make a dangerous winter journey to Pembroke Castle while heavily pregnant. For a 13-year-old whose body was still developing, this journey alone could have killed her. On January 28, 1457, the contractions began. Margaret's body, too small, too young, too underdeveloped, began bringing Edmund Tudor's son into the world. What happened next was documented by her confessor, Bishop John Fisher. He called it a miracle that a baby could be born of so little a personage. That's medieval speak for everyone expected both to die. Margaret's body was so underdeveloped that survival seemed impossible. The birth was catastrophic. The trauma so severe that despite Margaret marrying twice more, despite living long and becoming one of the most powerful women in England, she never had another child. One horrific childbirth at 13 permanently destroyed her ability to conceive. The damage was irreversible, and the son she delivered, who would become King Henry VII, was the only child her broken body could produce. But Margaret's experience wasn't unusual. It was just better documented. Medieval childbirth statistics are nightmares. Roughly 1 in 3 women died during childbirth or from complications. Every time a medieval woman got pregnant, she faced worse odds than a modern base jumper. Pregnancy wasn't a blessing. It was Russian roulette, and you'd pull that trigger repeatedly for your entire reproductive life. The medical care made everything worse. Medieval birthing practices were designed by people who understood nothing about anatomy or hygiene. They practiced bloodletting during labor, actively drained blood from women already losing blood. They used birthing chairs that were essentially torture devices, designed to speed delivery, often causing catastrophic tearing and internal damage. Wealthy women weren't better off. Money couldn't buy medical knowledge that didn't exist. Take Isabella of Aragon, who died giving birth at 18 after days of agonizing labor. She had the best physicians, the most comfortable chambers, every herbal remedy and prayer available. She still died, slowly, painfully, over multiple days while doctors tried everything and nothing worked. Noble women weren't allowed to space out pregnancies, weren't given time to heal. They were expected to get pregnant immediately after marriage and then continuously until menopause or death, whichever came first. Baby after baby, each pregnancy carrying that 1 in 3 chance of death, each birth damaging their bodies further. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of her era, survived 10 pregnancies, 10 times rolling the dice, 10 times facing those 1 in 3 odds. Most noble women faced 8 to 15 pregnancies. Imagine facing death 8 to 15 times, knowing the odds, knowing your luck would probably run out, having no choice. The pressure was enormous because producing heirs was literally a medieval wife's job. Her primary function, her reason for existing. A wife who couldn't produce children, especially male heirs, was considered a failure. Medieval medicine blamed the woman for everything. If pregnancy didn't happen, it was her failing. If she miscarried, her weakness. If she died in childbirth, that was tragic, but they could replace her. And if you survived multiple childbirths, you were probably so physically damaged that the rest of your life would be spent dealing with consequences. Prolapsed organs, torn muscles that never healed, chronic pain, incontinence, infections, internal scarring. Medieval women who survived didn't escape unscathed. They carried the damage forever. The heartbreaking part is that many were still teenagers when this cycle began. Margaret Beaufort was 13. Their bodies hadn't finished developing. Growth plates hadn't closed. Hips hadn't widened. And they were expected to immediately begin the process that would likely kill them. Medieval marriage wasn't about finding a partner. It was about finding someone willing to die repeatedly to continue your family line. Margaret Beaufort survived, but she never forgot. The trauma stayed with her for every remaining day of her long life. She became deeply religious, founding colleges and trying to create a better world. But she never had another child, never risked pregnancy again. One horrific experience was enough. For most medieval women, they didn't get that choice. They'd survive one traumatic birth and immediately face the next pregnancy. Until finally, one of those pregnancies would be the one they didn't survive. And their husband would mourn briefly, then start negotiations for the next wife. So you've survived your child marriage, endured the bedding ceremony, made it through childbirth. Now comes the really terrifying part. Living with a spouse who has legal right to beat you, imprison you, or kill you, all within bounds of the law. Medieval marriage laws weren't just unfair. They were terrifying. Under the legal doctrine of reasonable chastisement, husbands could physically discipline their wives for any behavior they deemed inappropriate. Reasonable was defined loosely. There are documented cases of husbands being legally cleared for beating wives with sticks as long as the stick was no thicker than their thumb. That's where rule of thumb may have originated. But let's talk about the ultimate example of legal spousal murder. Henry VIII. He lived at the very end of the medieval period, but he used medieval marriage laws to their most extreme conclusion. When his wives couldn't give him male heirs who survived, he didn't just divorce them, he had them executed. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, mother of the future Queen Elizabeth I. When she failed to produce a male heir and Henry grew tired of her, he had her tried for adultery, incest, and treason. The evidence was practically non-existent, the charges absurd. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother. But they didn't need real evidence. They just needed enough legal justification to eliminate an inconvenient wife. Under medieval law, a wife's adultery was considered treason against the crown. It threatened royal succession, cast doubt on the legitimacy of heirs, and the penalty for treason was death. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was beheaded. She was probably around 35. She walked to the scaffold with dignity, made a final speech refusing to condemn the king, and knelt before the executioner. With one swing, Henry VII's inconvenient second wife was eliminated, legally, officially, with full backing of courts and church. Catherine Howard got the same treatment. Henry's fifth wife, probably around 19 when executed. When Henry discovered her past relationships, he didn't hesitate, didn't show mercy based on her youth. He sent her to the block. Another inconvenient wife, another legal execution, another demonstration that medieval marriage gave husbands power of life and death. But here's the truly terrifying part. This wasn't just Henry being cruel. This was medieval marriage law working as designed. The system gave husbands absolute power. And when men like Henry VIII took that power to its extreme, society didn't stop them. Law protected them. Divorce was essentially impossible. The Catholic Church controlled marriage, and they only granted annulments under very specific circumstances. You had to prove the marriage was never valid, usually by proving it was never consummated, which required humiliating public examinations where women underwent physical inspections, where doctors and church officials would examine their bodies and make declarations about their sexual history in open court. Even if you could prove non-consummation and survive public humiliation, the process could take years, sometimes decades. It cost a fortune. Most couldn't afford it. So women were trapped in marriages with men who could legally beat them, rape them, and control every aspect of their lives. The law was crystal clear. A married woman had no legal identity separate from her husband. She couldn't own property, couldn't sign contracts, couldn't testify in court without his permission. If he decided to lock her away for life, that was his legal right. If he decided she needed punishment, he could beat her until she bled. If he decided she was inconvenient, he could find creative legal interpretations to eliminate her. Accusations of witchcraft were particularly convenient. Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, was accused of witchcraft and treason by her husband's political enemies, with her husband's full cooperation. Her crime wasn't witchcraft. Her crime was being politically inconvenient. She was tortured, publicly humiliated, forced to walk through London carrying a candle, then imprisoned for life. Her husband faced no consequences. Medieval courts weren't concerned with due process for inconvenient wives. The legal system was designed by men, for men, to protect male power. Women were property, and property didn't get to defend itself. Many women knew exactly what they were walking into. They understood that marriage meant giving up all legal rights, that they were placing their lives in their husband's hands, that he would have power to do whatever he wanted and they would have no recourse. But they had no choice, because unmarried women had even fewer options for survival. So when Henry VIII had 2 wives beheaded, he wasn't breaking medieval law. He was using it. Let's be brutally honest about what medieval marriage was. A business transaction where the merchandise happened to be human. If you think modern relationships involve too much financial negotiation, try living in an era where your father had to pay someone to take you. And not pocket change. We're talking dowries equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. The dowry system was legalized extortion. The bride's family had to pay the groom's family for the privilege of having him marry their daughter. These weren't token gestures. These were financial packages that could bankrupt entire families. Land deeds, cash payments, jewelry, livestock, political promises, everything of value packaged and handed over to ensure their daughter would be accepted. Take Isabella d'Este, one of the most influential women of the late medieval period. Her marriage negotiations took 3 years. Different families made competing offers, each trying to outbid the others with elaborate dowry packages. Isabella's final dowry included massive cash payments, extensive land holdings, priceless jewelry, and political alliances that would take decades to execute. But here's where it gets truly twisted. The bride's family wasn't just paying to get rid of their daughter. They were essentially purchasing protection and status for their family line. A daughter who married well could elevate the entire family. A daughter who married poorly could drag them down into poverty and disgrace. If you couldn't afford a decent dowry, your daughter's options were grim. She could remain unmarried, which meant poverty and social death. Or she could marry so far beneath her station that she'd disgrace the family. The pressure was enormous. Families would go into debt for decades to afford a daughter's dowry. They'd mortgage land, borrow from moneylenders at predatory rates, sacrifice everything for the chance to marry their daughter into a good family. The groom's family was making a calculated investment. They weren't just getting a wife. They were getting her dowry, her family's political connections, any future inheritance. They were analyzing the deal like venture capitalists. And the bride herself, once married, everything she owned, including the massive dowry her family had bankrupted themselves to provide, legally belonged to her husband. She went from being her father's property to being her husband's, and she brought her own purchase price. But the financial nightmare didn't end with the dowry. Medieval inheritance laws were designed to keep wealth in male hands. When a woman's husband died, she often lost everything. Property went to his male relatives. Money went to his heirs. She might get a small widow's pension if lucky, but more often, widows found themselves suddenly destitute. This created a vicious cycle. Desperate widows would remarry quickly, not for love but for survival. Some women married 4 or 5 times, each time hoping the next husband wouldn't die and leave them penniless. Others had no choice but to enter convents, not because they felt religious calling, but because it was the only way to avoid starvation. The most successful medieval women learned to game this system. Margaret Beaufort, despite her traumatic start, eventually became one of the richest women in England. She did it by carefully managing inheritances through multiple marriages, by choosing subsequent husbands strategically, by understanding the financial game and playing it better than most men. But she was exceptional. Here's the cruel irony. Even after bankrupting themselves to provide a dowry, families had no guarantee their daughter would be treated well. Once marriage was complete and dowry paid, the bride's family had no legal recourse. The money was gone. The daughter was legally dead to them. She belonged to her husband, and they were stuck with debt that might take generations to repay. This wasn't marriage. This was human trafficking with religious ceremonies and legal paperwork to make it seem legitimate. Here's the ultimate plot twist. All that trauma, the child marriages, the bedding ceremonies, the deadly childbirth, the spousal abuse, the financial ruin, you probably wouldn't endure it long, because medieval marriages came with a built-in expiration date: death. The average medieval marriage lasted about 15 to 20 years, not because couples grew apart, but because one of them died, usually the wife, thanks to that Russian roulette childbirth. But husbands weren't living to ripe old ages either. Wars, plagues, complete lack of understanding about hygiene. Medieval life was brutal and short for everyone. Take the Black Death, which swept through Europe in the 14th century and killed roughly 1/3 of the population. Imagine spending years negotiating your daughter's dowry, bankrupting your family to secure the perfect alliance, planning the elaborate ceremony, then having plague wipe out half the wedding party within months. Suddenly, all those calculations meant nothing. But here's where medieval practicality gets dark. People adapted. They treated marriage like a revolving door. Remarriage wasn't just common, it was essential for survival. Widows and widowers would remarry within months, sometimes weeks, not because they were heartless, But because being unmarried was essentially a death sentence of its own, women became serial wives out of necessity. They'd marry, survive a few years if lucky, become widowed, then immediately start hunting for the next husband before their resources ran out. It was like a grim game of musical chairs, where the music could stop at any moment and leave you without support. The wealthy had it slightly better because they could afford to stay single longer, but even they felt the pressure. Noble families would arrange backup marriages for their children, literally having contingency plans for when, not if, the first spouse died. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included clauses about remarriage options. They were planning for death before the wedding even happened. Here's something that shows how normalized death was. Wedding ceremonies included prayers not just for happiness and fertility, but for souls after death. Priests would bless marriages while simultaneously preparing everyone for the inevitable funeral, probably coming sooner rather than later. The constant threat of death created bizarre inheritance situations. Some women outlived 3 or 4 husbands, accumulating wealth from each one, becoming incredibly powerful. Others lost everything each time they were widowed and had to start over. Children from these serial marriages created incredibly complex family trees. You might have half-siblings from your mother's previous marriages, step-siblings from your father's. No guarantee that any relationships would last more than a few years before another death reshuffled everything. Church records read like soap opera scripts. The psychological impact was enormous. Medieval people couldn't afford to get too attached to their spouses. Emotional connection was risky when death was always lurking. Marriage was about survival and alliance building, not emotional bonding. And yet, despite all this death and trauma, despite knowing the odds, people kept getting married. They kept having children. They kept arranging dowries and facing down the horrors. Because in medieval society, even a dangerous, potentially deadly marriage was still safer than facing the world alone. When medieval couples promised "till death do us part," they weren't being romantic. They were being realistic. Death was the only reliable way out. The only exit that didn't require expensive annulments or accusations or political maneuvering. Death was guaranteed, expected, coming for everyone. The only question was whether it would come for you first or your spouse. For women especially, death might have been merciful. A quick death from plague or childbirth meant escape from the cycle of pregnancy and trauma. It meant no more beatings, no more public humiliation, no more living as property. Death was the only freedom medieval women could reliably expect, the only escape from a system designed to consume them. And when that death finally came, the system simply recycled everyone into new marriages, new alliances, new financial transactions. The individual people were replaceable. The institution of marriage continued. The cycle never stopped. So there you have it. The brutal reality of medieval marriage laid bare. Child brides sold like livestock. Wedding nights transformed into public spectacles. Childbirth that was a slow-motion death sentence. Husbands with legal right to murder their wives. Dowries that bankrupted families. Deaths so frequent people built them into their wedding vows. This wasn't romance. This wasn't partnership. This wasn't love. This was systematic oppression packaged as holy matrimony. An economic system that consumed women's bodies, freedoms, and lives to perpetuate male power. And it was legal, sanctioned, celebrated by church and state. Margaret Beaufort survived but carried the scars forever. Isabella of Valois played with her dolls while legally bound to a grown man. Anne Boleyn lost her head because she couldn't produce the right heir. Thousands upon thousands of medieval women whose names we'll never know faced these same horrors. They endured. They survived when they could. They died when they couldn't. And history mostly forgot them. But now you know. You know what marriage really meant before we romanticized it and sold it as fairy tales. You know what our ancestors endured. You know why every freedom you have, every choice you make, every relationship you walk away from is a privilege medieval women would have died for. So the next time you complain about modern dating, about relationship complications, about commitment fears, or any of the 1,000 little dramas that fill our romantic lives, remember this. Remember 12-year-old Margaret going into labor. Remember 6-year-old Isabella clutching her dolls at her wedding. Remember Anne Boleyn walking to the scaffold. Remember every medieval woman who said "I do," knowing it might be the last free choice she ever made. Your worst breakup is paradise compared to their best marriage. Your loneliest night is freedom compared to their wedding nights. Your most complicated situationship is liberation compared to their lifetime of legal slavery. So maybe modern love isn't so bad. Maybe having choices, having freedom, having the ability to walk away makes us the luckiest people in human history. Maybe every swipe left, every failed first date, every relationship that didn't work out is actually a celebration of the fact that we get to choose, that nobody owns us, that our bodies belong to ourselves, that marriage is a choice, not a death sentence. Medieval marriage was a nightmare that lasted for centuries, a systematic brutality that shaped the lives of millions. We're only a few generations removed from its shadow, from its darkness. And if this glimpse into that darkness makes you grateful for the present, for your autonomy, for your freedom to love or not love as you choose, then maybe you'll understand why history matters, why we need to remember what came before, why we can never take our freedoms for granted, because the past isn't really past. It's right there behind us, close enough to touch, close enough to remind us how far we've come and how easily we could slip backward if we stop paying attention. So live your life, make your choices, love who you want, leave who you must, and be grateful every single day that you're not living in a time when marriage meant losing everything, including yourself. Welcome to the 21st century, where even your worst relationship is still infinitely better than their fairy tale ending.